All right, Lucky,
Okay.
we'll kick this off. Tell us about startup procedures in a B-17.
Well, the first thing was to see if the controls were unlocked. I don't remember a lock like that. Well, just set the brakes. Then start at number 1. Mags on, fuel bumps pumped. Prop hitch, back, and fire 1, get her going and repeat the process. That's as much as I remember.
And then you would taxi out onto the perimeter track from here.
Right. And they were talking last night that they checked the mags running down on takeoff, and we never did that. I don't know how in the world the guy that was talking maintained that the engines overheated on run up to the point that they didn't want to get them too hot, then they'd have to check the mags on takeoff. And what I wanted to ask him is, what did you do if your mags didn't mesh? Because you'd be committed for takeoff, and if you had a mag that was malfunctioning or misfiring, you had no recourse but to chop the throttles and get on the brakes or ground loop. So that was a real mystery to me.
Can you, after you guys were out on the perimeter track, can you describe what would actually happen next, the actual takeoff procedure? After they fired the takeoff
Well,
flare?
you'd set the cowl flaps, and you'd set the, depending upon your load, you'd set the flaps. We would often take off with about a quarter flaps if we were real heavy, and lock the tail wheel and throw the power to it. When I flew the one in Savannah, they wouldn't let me take it off. I didn't get control until after we got airborne. But I'd like to have done that.
If they gave you the option, you think you could have done it? The takeoff
I don't
and
think
landing?
there's any question I could have done it. Take off and landed both. And I wanted to prove it, that an old 91-year-old geezer could still do it.
Well, you proved that you could still fly it. That was impressive.
But when you get a hold of one of these queens, it all comes back to you. It's just like riding a bicycle. It all is very familiar. This is a dream to fly. I never flew anything that was as pleasurable as flying a B-17.
Rolling when you were taking off.
Well, you've got good visibility, and of course out the sides as well. So, and actually the textbook takeoff in a B-17 is a 3-point takeoff. You don't raise the tail. And I was amazed to read that in the manual that was the desirable, because you got lift quicker in a tail down position than you did if you lifted it. But we would feel the tail lift up almost automatically once we threw the power to it, and so it was not not too easy really to take a 3-point takeoff, to make one. But our vision of the runway, I could see the runway here, and of course it was up to the co-pilot to keep you straight. When we made an instrument takeoff, which we had to do quite frequently, we developed a technique of having the co-pilot keep the airplane on the runway or down the center line of the runway, and the pilot would be on instruments from the time you released the brakes. So you didn't make that transition once you got off the ground and from visual and onto instruments, because that's when you get vertigo, and that's when we lost a lot of crews. So it was really essential that the pilot be flying instruments from the get-go, and just let the co-pilot keep the plane straight on the runway on takeoff. Because it wasn't too infrequent that the overcast was only 10 feet or 25 feet off the runway.
And when you were on instruments, the artificial horizon would be the main one you were monitoring?
Yes. That and your climb indicator. Of course, you're keeping your compass heading zeroed. So it was far better to be following those, monitoring those, for the pilot to be doing that than it would be for him to be watching the runway and then shifting or transitioning to instruments, because you can very easily think you're right side up when you're upside down.
Now, Lucky, when you went over and you would like fly to a splasher or a radio point, you did not have an ADF. Did you use was it sound on the radio that flew, or did you have a VOR of some type somewhere to fly a needle, or how would you track that beacon?
Well, we had an indicator. We had an ADF of sorts.
Okay, you did, and it would point towards
and
it.
we would orbit the splasher.
Mm-hmm.
Splasher 6, and that's where the name of our newsletter comes from, was just off our runway, and we had a procedure coming back to home on that splasher and then make procedure turns and let downs to climb the runway, because oftentimes it wasn't visual. Couldn't see it.
Well, thanks, Lucky. We appreciate you hopping back up in the cockpit one more time for us.
Well, I'm more than happy to. It's my privilege to be back here, back home.